It is time now for a panel discussion to dive into some of these topics that we've talked about in the last hour or so. And we've got some experts in our field who are going to talk about what they're seeing, what should be done, what could be done. I'd like to welcome to the stage Hannah Crosby, who's going to be the moderator today. She's the Director for Project and Export Finance at ANZ Institutional. Hannah, great to see you coming on up. I'm actually on the panel as well, along with Richard Briggs, who's the CEO of Hamilton City Council, Stephen Town, who's also the CEO, but of the Auckland Council, and Brad Ward, who is the Deputy CEO of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. So, come on up. I think we've got everyone. Great, good to see you. Fantastic, we're all coming on up, and there will be some time, we hope, for some Q&A at the end. So, Hannah, I'm throwing it to you.
Yep, thank you. Morena, good morning everybody. My name is Hannah Crosby. I'm a director in the project finance team at ANZ. Although I'm currently based in Auckland, I still cringe to call myself an Aucklander. At heart, I'm an Nelsonian, and as somewhere I grew up, I'm a strong advocate for regional New Zealand. Our topic today is planning, funding, and delivering urban development at scale. This is, as we've heard, this is a huge problem, particularly in the growth areas around New Zealand. It's something that we really need to get right to ensure that, firstly, that we solve the infrastructure and housing deficit, but also that we do it in a way that creates communities that thrive. And I think that, you know, what we heard yesterday from the millennial session is really important here, because I believe that a community that thrives is a community that takes into account people's well-being, things like people's mental health, the connectivity, and creating communities where you can walk and you can enjoy them. And I'm really excited that we've got a range of panellists here with a variety of perspectives. Obviously, Bernard's independent and can say whatever he likes, which is a good thing.
Unemployable.
And we've also got the perspectives of both local and central government. So, you know, everybody on this stage has got a really keen interest in delivering housing and urban development at scale and getting it right. So today I'd like to cover an assessment of how we think we're doing, you know, to date, how have we been going at delivering housing and urban development at scale? What are the various tools that have been employed to help us do that? And, you know, have they worked? Have they not worked? Are there things that we need to tweak going forward to get a better outcome? And also think about what else can be done to accelerate delivery. So I might just start with you, Bernard. You've written some interesting pieces recently where you've been reasonably critical about how we have been going at delivering housing and urban development at scale, and you sort of referred to it when you were talking about the old leafies earlier. You know, what's your assessment? How are we going, and what could we be doing better?
Frankly, it's a disaster. Easy for me to say that because, again, I'm not responsible for it. But I'll give you a little anecdote of how much of a disaster. So I'm in Wellington in the Parliamentary Press Gallery, and we have 4 relatively young journalists working there with us, one of whom is married in her early 30s with a teacher as a husband. And I had a long conversation with her a few weeks ago about, you know, what she's up to and where she goes and what she does. And essentially, she's from a reasonably well-off background. She's a professional. She's excellent at her job, and so is her husband. They earn a good income, probably combined over 100K a year. They have given up on ever owning a home, and have essentially postponed or basically given up on having a family. because there's no way they can afford to have a family in a place they want to, and also have some space or whatever. So essentially, she's being forced to think about, what do I do? Do I move to Gore? Do I move to Adelaide? Because I can't afford to live in this country anymore. And she's a professional earning a good wage at the top of her game. So when that person is unable to get housing, we've got a problem. Currently, pick your number, but somewhere between 100,000 to 500,000 houses need to be built in New Zealand for the scale of our population and for what's happening to the number of people per home. And for me, it's frankly a scandal that we are sitting around here talking about, doing legislation and coming up with funding vehicles that will come up with maybe $50 or $100 million here or there, when we all know we need to spend $100, $200 billion over the next 10 to 20 years if we're ever going to achieve the stuff we're talking about. And this government is in the best position of pretty much any developed world government to do it, but refuses, at the behest of its voters, and to use its balance sheet. And we're in this crazy situation where Milldale is mentioned earlier, and good on the Treasury for having a crack at it. They've been told to by essentially voters to do it. But it's not going to be of the scale or at the speed to deal with this issue. Councils, growth councils, will not fund the infrastructure. And we have a fundamental problem here, which is that the government benefits when it opens the door and brings in people, but it will not pay for the infrastructure because it believes that growth pays for growth, which it doesn't, certainly not within a political cycle that mayors and councillors think about, and the government itself won't use its balance sheet. So I see a big standoff where everyone points at each other and says, I want this infrastructure, but I'm not going to pay for it, someone else will. And even when you get someone else with a big balance sheet and an appetite, like the super fund, we heard from the minister earlier today that process has been delayed until next year because the government wants to transfer the risk to someone else. That is just crazy. And I don't understand why a country which has a tax system which is perfectly excellent at collecting revenues from a growing economy and a growing population does not use some of that to fund at 0.98% the infrastructure spend and the re-engineering of our cities needed to solve our basic problems.
We've got two of the CEOs of growth councils here. How do you respond to that? What are the things that you've been trying to effect to deliver our housing and urban development, and how are you going to deliver this going forward?
Oh, well, first of all, I think from our point of view, we would also congratulate Treasury on actually getting underneath the skin of local government and understanding what our constraints are and why it is difficult to convince a group of elected members that they should pay for effectively a portion of the nation's growth. So we, all power to Treasury for coming up with that model, working with us. The bottom line for Milldale, though, is that it's a drop in the ocean, and we need lots of those approaches, and they'll need to be tailored. But I do think we can crank up the delivery of new growth areas. I think we can go faster. The big risk that we've got right now, and Bernard and others have referred to it, as we crank up housing supply and the building of new communities, the really big bulk infrastructure that does need to be paid for in partnership with central government, it's that piece of the puzzle that is in steep decline, and we've lost all of the momentum that we had in the last 2 years. I think I'm right in saying that NZTA hasn't led a major project for a couple of years now. So that pipeline is disappearing. Those resources and the ability to do things faster is leaving the country as we speak.
Richard, what's your experience in Hamilton?
Yeah, so Hamilton is ideally located in terms of growth. We sort of get the spillover from Auckland, as well as there's organic growth from around the Waikato region. The commentary about it being a disaster, I feel that. I've got a 27-year-old daughter that struggled to get into her first home. I know what that's like. And the banker dad always has a part to play. But we are doing a lot now, and whether it's a little bit too late, there's this rhetoric around that we've got a funding, local government's got a funding issue. Actually, local government's had a planning issue for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years in terms of predicting the level of investment that's required, and that's been mostly overlaid by political inability to actually put the rates to a level that's required to actually fund. Rates are low. The services we get for our rates are really low. If we could actually put those up, we wouldn't need an off-balance sheet solution like a special purpose vehicle. Totally appreciative. We're doing a lot of work with Treasury, fully echo Stephen and Bernard's comments about the quality of the work Treasury is doing. But ultimately, the community's going to have to pay for that, right? Someone always has to pay. So I think there's a bigger fundamental issue in terms of how we approach this level of investment. And so we're working really hard. Hamilton City is a really ambitious council, both at an elected member level and at an executive level. We push hard. We have a really good relationship with our neighbouring councils. We also have a very good relationship with Auckland, Tauranga, and Queenstown being the sort of large growth councils. And we've worked really hard to try to take a bigger non-boundary focused approach and follow that spatial planning approach for trying to generate some of that growth. And it needs to be large, wholesale development, but it needs to be community orientated. And one of the observations I've got is probably at this point in time, the collaboration between local government and central government is probably the best it's been in years. We have a really good relationship with government ministries and departments. But more needs to be done, and even the commentary today from Patrick in respect to the Housing New Zealand setting up their own building control authority, which is admirable, and I understand why with the building program to that extent. But my challenge is we can't even recruit building inspectors and building professionals now within the local government sector. So there's a challenge in developing this pipeline, and to go big, better and bold, how are we going to compete with another building control authority start poaching our staff? So there's this disconnect within government. So one of the things we're pushing is, rather than taking a output-based approach, roads, waters, prisons, schools, education, we're taking a spatial planning approach and collaborating, and we had Minister Twyford and Mahuta signing up to our growth agenda for the Auckland to Hamilton corridor, which is very much taking a community-orientated view and looking at that to leverage across all portfolios, a 30-year infrastructure plan across all agencies, what they are, including the private sector. Go hard, go big, and starting addressing, if we can get 30 years worth of investment in the Auckland to Hamilton corridor, we could set up through the Polytechs a Polytechnic focus with this work program to support and actually grow the staff through it. We could actually take a bigger step. So what we're trying to do is be as ambitious as we can, drive it as hard as we can, and try and shake things up, and the more ambition you show and the more stories you tell, the more you can actually go beyond the electoral cycles. The challenge we've got is we've been very poor at telling the stories to the extent that the real issues aren't debated in politics. That's the challenge, and so we've got to make the real issues we're confronted with, which is this, actually a topic of discussion with the community. So they actually expect that we invest. When people in Hamilton are talking about stopping growth, I was about to go see Stephen whether or not he would pay for a wall. It's just...
Because the issue here is that voters in councils were never asked, would you like to see New Zealand having 6 million, 7 million people in the next decade? This was just done as an assumption. And now, essentially, ratepayers in these cities are saying, actually, no, I like my suburban life, my leafy life. I don't want to allow these other people in. I can vote with my vote in a council election and for a mayor or a councillor who doesn't do the infrastructure, who blocks it, who uses the RMA and the Environment Court and lots of excuses to say, no, I don't want that development. And I just wonder, for Auckland and Hamilton, I'd like to ask, could you cope with an extra 500,000 people in the next 6 or 7 years? Because that's the trajectory of the population growth at the moment, and is likely to get worse, particularly with the challenges of climate change and the fact we're a good-looking place and the rest of the world's in a bit of a mess.
450? 50?
Yeah, look, I think that's too fast. I mean, we're to 30 June, 14,000 residential dwelling consents issued. So, you know, that's, if we go back to the low of post-GFC, that's in 6 months, 7,000 consents. So, you know, a whole year's worth in 6 months. So even if we get to 20,000 consents a year, we won't be able to accommodate 500,000 people in that sort of time frame. So it does become a question of, you know, what's the nation's ambition for the size of population that would make sense for New Zealand. And I think we would say in Auckland, what we can observe is that there is growing disparity of opportunity and prosperity. And the people that own properties and have good incomes are doing much better than those who are renting and don't have the bank of dad and mum to get them going. So that gap is widening, and we do need to have a grown-up conversation about it.
And that sort of reminds me of what they were talking about yesterday on the panel, where they were talking about having a vision and potentially, you know, does New Zealand's population come into that in terms of what we're looking for and, you know, what we want to be as a country. And I know, Brad, you and central government are doing a lot of work as well. What are the programs that you're looking at? And I think particularly you're going to be involved in the Kāinga Ora agency. Yep. You know, how are you aligning with local government, and how are you going to drive forward housing and urban development?
Well, I mean, there's a number of things central government's got underway, either delivered or in delivery. So some of them have been talked about today by the ministers around the urban growth agenda, and particularly around spatial planning and better land use planning and better basically network planning in places like Auckland-Hamilton corridor, Hamilton, Queenstown. And we might think, you know, that's a bit pointy-headed and what's the purpose of it, but actually one of the fundamentals I think that we have missed in New Zealand over the years is actually the ability for central and local government to do proper coordinated planning at a regional level. And actually we haven't done spatial planning. So if you go to places, I was in the delegation of Structure New Zealand to China, and everyone, I think, or a number of people have perception that you go to a lot of Asian countries, China in particular, and swarms, you know, massive amounts of land and just put up whatever they want, and you know, it's mixed quality. What was really telling, and I think is a lesson for us here and something we're trying to implement, but from a very low starting base, is actually in China, they spend a lot of time spatially planning, master planning these developments. And they're not talking about 10,000 dwellings going into an area, they're talking 10, 20 million, they're talking cities. And that's a skill set that an experience we don't have in great numbers in New Zealand, but we are actively now getting into that space, and that's an example of central and local government. So the Auckland-Hamilton corridor that was announced last week, further progress on that is a classic case in point. You might go, well, that's planning, so what? How does that translate to actually houses? And well, if we don't do that, we're never going to get the planning and the scale. You're never going to work out where do you want your transport routes to go that also match with where you want your education providers to be located, where do you want your hospitals to go, where do you want your business, where do people want to work, and therefore how do you make sure there's enough land use to actually get the supply in a much faster way than we've done in the past. What we don't want to do is just build for the sake of building and then find we have ad hoc disconnected communities and the issues that we've had in the past, and now we're having to actually look at significant regeneration in a number of our cities as a result.
But is the new Infrastructure Commission Ministry, is that going to make a difference there?
I think, I do. I think it will. Because what's happened across central government is you've had housing doing things, and you've had MOT doing stuff, you might have DIA doing stuff, and education and health, and it's been disconnected. And a country the size of New Zealand, you'd think we would have the ability, even across central government, to better coordinate, but we haven't in the past. So I think the Infrastructure Commission, the Urban Growth Authority, the ability to work on spatial plans is pulling things tighter. It is going to get the greater coordination. I think you need that. But I think to your point, Bernard, and I think the frustration that people have got is we've got to get these settings right. And I think they just haven't been there. And unfortunately, that's the reality. But we need to get them right damn quick, and then we need to crack on. Because, you know, if you look at just interesting stats, you're talking about, you know, supply of houses. You look at Auckland, lower quartile, only 18% of houses at the moment in Auckland are built in the lower quartile, which is sort of 750k lower. You go to Wellington, it's 5%. So we've got it's undeniable, you know, you can't deny we've got a massive task ahead of us, but I think all of us here, I'd say from central and local government, want to be part of trying to fix that and get the settings right and starting to make a positive impact.
So just the specifics of the Auckland-Hamilton corridor partnership, is that similar to sort of a memorandum of understanding of the principles that you will use in planning that will then go into your individual plans, or how does that work in practice?
So we've got a commitment in a time frame for pulling together a spatial plan in the next 12 months. So for the Waikato, for the Hamilton Metro spatial area. So that's going to be a blueprint for a level of engagement across all sectors in terms of what that development's going to look like, enabled to prioritise. So it's going to be action orientated, which is one of the key messages that came out from a central government point of view. And then a similar approach in terms of detailed planning for the corridor all the way through to Auckland, including planning for the commuter rail aspects and other ways of leveraging intermodal transport as well.
Look, I think the key test for the spatial plan, and we've had some experience of this in Auckland because Auckland did its first spatial plan and development approach under the super city arrangements, and unfortunately the government of the day decided not to endorse that plan, so they didn't take a position on it. We've now moved forward in quite a positive way because the government and local government are entering into these arrangements where they're saying we're going to do it together, and hopefully we're going to commit then to integrated implementation. And we heard quite a theme on this yesterday. It's the integrated implementation and execution that we're probably not super good at the moment, because we kind of drift back into our corners and, you know, we just don't get the go forward that we would need to do the things that need to be done.
We're good at planning.
But I think, apart from the planning, which we need to, you know, I think we are starting to see some positive signs in a number of urban centres. The IFF, I think we shouldn't understate still the value that brings. And I mean, Mulmildale as a pilot, there are significant discussions happening across other locations. And what those discussions are doing is they are actually pulling together the different components, whether it be private funding, Crown, local government, actually pulling us together in a more coordinated way and going, okay, what are the areas that we actually want to focus on, and let's actually try and resolve those together. Whereas in the past, what we've had is, oh, no, I don't want to go there. You go there, Crown. Crown goes, I don't want to pay for all of it. Private sector goes, I want local council. Council go, I don't want to do it. Crown do it. And we end up with basically stalemate.
I'm curious, though, whether you can, at scale, do this infrastructure development with those infrastructure bonds and special purpose vehicles when the investors actually just want government bonds. And the ratings agencies look straight through these things and go, wow, that's backed by the government and the council, and ultimately they're the ones who will have to pay for it. And you end up simply paying a big old margin for the funding on top of government's actually doing the borrowing and spending the money in its own right. And the best example is Housing New Zealand. I mean, it's the one that's actually making the most progress at the moment, and it did that simply by borrowing $1.5 billion a year, ironically in their own right, and having to pay a slight margin on top of government borrowing rates, which Treasury itself reckoned was going to cost an extra $11 million. I just wonder, in this itsy-bitsy approach with this IFS process, whether the investors have looked at this, and the ratings agencies have looked at this and said, yeah, there's scale here. Because if I'm a fund manager in Europe or even a Kiwi fund manager, I don't want to buy an illiquid bond from something where it's not exactly clear who the final underwriting person is or who's going to guarantee the debt. I just want a freaking government bond.
So I might be a bit out of my depth here because it's more game, but look, how I look at it is each of the deals will obviously, I mean, whether it be Milldale or some other site, obviously will need to be looked at as specifics as any project is. But what gives me some confidence is I know who has been involved in the setup of the IFF, and this isn't just policy wonks and no offence to Treasury or my HUD officials, but it's not just central government just coming with the idea, and it's not just local government as well. It's been worked up a lot with people in the finance industry here and overseas who actually have a lot of experience, and that gives me some confidence. It's also people who have been involved in previous exercises like ultra-fast broadband that I think people at the early days would have said that would never work, right? But that financially model for ultra-fast broadband actually has enabled us to basically provide for fibre to nearly 95% of the country. That was a completely new funding and financing model as well. And so I have some confidence, and the proof will be in the pudding, but I think the people who are involved in setting it up, I think have the credibility that I think will give it a success.
I think you're actually doing a disservice, to be fair. I mean, you're actually being a leafy in this respect and suggesting that potentially these ideas won't make a difference or move the dial. We're not going to put all this effort into driving a solution like this for a tin pot development, right? We're talking about looking at what the optimal, in our case, what the optimal development is between the western side of the Golden Triangle and how we can leverage that. We're talking about employment land, we're talking about housing, we're talking about social infrastructure. It is a significant investment. And for once, and it's what we've got, our governance for this operation has not only the mayors and the chairs of the regional and the councils, we've also got 2 government ministers sitting around the table driving it, right? And they're not going to waste their time on a tin pot development either. So, and the advantage, I mean, I'm all for actually let's just remove our fiduciary levels and get the government to guarantee all my debt and let's get on with it, right? We'll just build. But for once, what it's doing is it's focusing the conversation on the actual growth itself, rather than losing it in the bureaucratic mess that's local government or central government in terms of how you allocate your funding from a fiscal perspective. So what we've now got is, and Kate talked about it, is the ability to actually have a return on investment, invest your money in a smart way. You just have a generic government bond. The same process happens right now. It'll be an output-orientated investment which looks at schools independent of healthcare, independent of corrections, independent of police, local government infrastructure. We're actually taking the whole kit and caboodle. What is the investment required to build a bloody community right here and make it work? And that's big, right? That's a complete change of philosophy. So
who was the investor behind Milldale?
Who's
ACC.
Sorry?
ACC. Yeah. Yep. So I just challenge, I mean, you're right, maybe I'm being unfair, but I'm challenging this idea that everyone here and the government and Treasury seems to accept that the Milldale model is going to solve this problem. I don't think, if you're going to do it, be serious about dealing with this issue, that it will. And from the people I talk to, outside of the really big projects in Auckland, they're going, Milldale is just not of a scale enough or fast enough or has enough connection to those investors to make a difference.
But you can have the situation once you roll out that pilot that you can actually package up some of these assets, and they might be, possibly the challenges if they're under disparate councils, that you can package them up and they do become of a scale that is a good investment product and potentially a capital markets product.
And this is Hamilton, we're a tenth of the size of Auckland, just about everything, rule of thumb, so 14,000 consents, 1,400 consents, so we pretty much work in rule of thumb. But like one of our growth cells, we cracked it open, our investment's $500 million, right? You throw on top probably matching central government investment, and then you throw on top probably 50% of that again for the local infrastructure, if not more. You could easily get away with, just for a 10,000 house subdivision could easily be, you know, $1.5 billion worth of investment, right? This stuff is favourable, and you made the comment before about with interest rates, say, well, you're looking at a whole lot of well-resourced entities that are looking at putting their money somewhere, they're not going to get 0.98% or whatever the number was. They want better returns. We're in an advantage now, though. We've got a bit of leverage in terms of where the OCR is to actually negotiate some better rates for a longer term as well. So don't lose the opportunity of continuing with the same mass approach we've done for the last 30 years has been the solution. It hasn't bloody worked, so let's find another way of doing it and change the paradigm and move forward. And the challenge is right. We need people to keep us honest. But I like the idea, I like the SPV model, is it's set by government and a bunch of elected members can't come along the following year and decide to throw extra costs into it. So that's why I like it as well, because it's actually fixed and it provides protection from elected member interference, which is not a bad or a good thing because I'm employed by some, but that's where I see the value as well.
But you are right. I mean, the intent is that it will be at a bigger scale than Milldale, and there's discussions around other sites now. But I think the beauty of the IFF as well is it's not intended to solve, for example, all of the infrastructure funding. It's got to be part of but a major part of the actual solution, because I think what's happened in the past is we've basically gone into a large development, and we've said the Crown, you pay for the infrastructure. It could be, you know, for some of the large developments, it could be $500 million. And then we go, no, council, you pay for it. And we go, no, and then we basically get scared by the numbers and everything just stalls. What IFF, I think, is the beauty of it potentially is it can come in and it can be part of the offering. So the Crown doesn't get so scared by the actual delta or the difference it needs to make up, and neither does the council.
Look, I think the breakthrough for me of Milldale is finding a new revenue tool. And it won't be the silver bullet, but it is scalable and we can repeat it. We've still got some bigger challenges in brownfields because we've got a lot of existing ratepayers sitting in brownfields who wouldn't react well to a new levy, even if it's not rates. But those are problems that can be overcome, and I think everyone over the last 2 days has said we don't just need one new tool, we need 8 or 9, and so that we can choose the one that is right for the particular location that we're trying to accelerate. And look, if we're going to get some big transport projects back up that are our roads, as well as the public transport, we have to have transport pricing. We've got to get the political leadership at all levels and on all sides to accept that we need transport pricing to price the use of those corridors.
What about some of the other funding tools? The Productivity Commission talked about some sort of fund that was connected to, council consenting of building work put in place, GST, and we've just been told this morning, talk to the hand. Fair enough. Other ways to skin the cat here, value capture uplift. I mean, how much progress is being made on some of these other things? Congestion charges, as you suggest. I just wondered, now that the GST thing seems to have been ruled out by everyone and his dog, what are the other tools around that people could go for?
So Kaingaora Homes and Communities, when it's set up, which is hopefully by 1 October, it's going to have its powers. The powers will come later. They'll probably be about mid-year, mid-next year. That will also have the ability, as part of, if sites are deemed specified development sites, will have the ability to apply for targeted rates as well. And that will obviously involve co-investment with other parties as well. So, I can envisage a scenario, a large-scale site could be 10,000, 20,000 dwellings, where you might have a mix of IFF and it might be an SD specified development site under Kaingaora, and you'd couple that financing together. So, bit by bit, we're trying to break down what looks like a massive cake so we can bite off more and do it sooner.
The uplift argument's an interesting one as well, right? We make a lot of people rich when we put through our infrastructure. So, but that conversation happens now anyway. you know, we enter into, and I'm sure Auckland does as well, when you're working on these large-scale developments, we have these conversations about who puts the infrastructure in, who's going to pay for it, what's the real value, whether we get, you know, we probably don't get, you know, anywhere near our share of the uplift, but we do get some contribution towards our costs as well. So it's something that we need probably a bit of clarity behind, right?
And is legislation needed to make that stuff really work? In terms of targeted rates, value capture, uplift? Obviously we know about the infrastructure bonds, but do the councils have enough tools at their disposal to make this happen?
Actually, the Rating Act's actually quite flexible. We can do a lot with targeted rates. So a lot of councils choose not to use them, but we can do a lot of things. But it's the mechanism by which identifying the uplift and taxing that. So it might be some attempt to change some of the tools within the Rating Act to enable us to focus a little bit better on that uplift might make some sense.
3 letters that we haven't talked about that are the scariest around are RMA. But can all this be done with the existing RMA?
Well, we still need some real work to be done the way around how the RMA is influenced by and creates issues with when we get into the Land Transport Management Act and the Local Government Act. So at the moment, our understanding is that Minister Parker wants to do the RMA, and that yes, there is a conversation about then how does other legislation fit with that, but they're not going to try and do it all in one single pass, which I think is sensible. So we do need to change the Public Works Act, the Land Transport Management Act and the Local Government Act to complement and deal with issues out of the RMA. I mean, the most disappointing thing about the RMA is that, you know, we've had these site-by-site environmental battles for 20 years, and it's a horrific waste of money and energy and community. All the community building opportunities are often lost because we're so busy fighting with each other.
Do you think the national policy statement announced yesterday will have an effect and affect the way you think about planning and growth going forward?
Well, the RMA always envisaged that these national policy statements would arrive probably a decade ago. So the more national clarity you can have about what you should be doing. We're a tiny country. We have 5 million arguments at the moment about what we should do, and I think we've got to agree to narrow those arguments to certain things that are really important to New Zealanders, and actually accept a bit more compromise about some of the things that we do in our cities.
Also, I think there needs to be more acknowledgement from the government, or both sides of politics, that when you tell councils that they're going to have to do something, and it may involve some extra cost, that they help those councils out with some funding tools. Now, GST's off the table, but there must be other ways that the government can help, because at the moment, growth doesn't pay for growth. Growth pumps up the government's surplus. It's currently at 7 billion. And the costs of the infrastructure development, it seems to me, fall mostly, or at least a large chunk of it, on councils. And the way that councils and the political economy of council works, it is impossible for councillors and mayors to say to ratepayers, growth pays for growth. They say no. And we're stuck in this horrible Mexican standoff where people are sleeping on streets and kids are ending up in hospital with skin infections because when we haven't got that right.
Yeah, it's interesting Tim's comment about infrastructure being overly complex and too many layers included in it. And picking up, we've got a policy of growth pays for growth in Hamilton City. We've also got some very, very angry developers. And so this year's election is going to be quite interesting, and some of the developers are very vocal in terms of what they expect. But we've chosen not to use the tools that are available. You know, we could well have introduced, 95% of our rates is general rate. We don't have huge numbers of targeted rates. So we've got this really simple system which doesn't cater for complex issues. And so the RMA is one issue. I think it's the fact that, you know, councils get political with the RMA and lawyers get rich. The Rating Act is purposeful, but councils decide not to use it. Local Government Act has opportunities within it. We don't challenge them, because when it comes down to it, is they don't want to upset the constituency, and that's unfortunately the issue.
And that's the guts of the issue, isn't it? This is a political economy problem in both a national and a local sense. Hey, we have a chance now to do a poll. Hannah, is it a good time to do this poll?
I don't think I've got the poll on here, but you might need to do the poll.
As I understand it, there's going to be a Becker poll. Is that right? Where we ask the question, how confident are you that the government's urban growth agenda will shift the needle on provision of affordable housing? And my understanding is that people can vote, and we'll get the results later on. But I just wondered, before we finish up, whether we should take a few questions from the audience?
Yeah, there's a few coming through on Slido. Yeah. Actually, just, sort of harking back to the original story about the 27-year-old that can't buy a house. One of the questions coming through is, is this an antiquated idea that you must buy a house? Should we be really focusing on build-to-rent solutions and, potentially shoring up our rental laws rather than having that 1960s dream of having a big backyard and owning your own home?
Right.
Yes.
We should.
Who here rents?
I think they should. I think if you look around European and American cities, long-term rentals are considered as good as owning your own home, right? You get the ability to customise, and you're responsible for fit out and kit out like a commercial lease. And there's no shame in that, right? It's an option.
But the New Zealand way
that's the challenge.
Is to own property as a financial decision, to leverage it up and make tax-free capital gains.
At low interest rates as well.
Yeah, and so what you end up with is headlines like in yesterday's Dominion Post, houses earn more than people's jobs last year. Yeah. And people realise this and know that the only way to get ahead in New Zealand is to own property. And if you're a renter, you're essentially, in the New Zealand scene, you're a second-class citizen. And for a lot of people, it's a cultural thing as much as some sort of rational decision.
I think, the focus, the government's focus is unashamedly on, there is a focus on housing affordability, but I think equally there is a big focus on public housing. The government, when they came in, announced 6,400 new state houses over 4 years, and HNZ are well on the way to that, and I think that is a change, and I think that's a recognition that policy can't just be about a single focus around affordability. It has to be around those people who need the state to provide for social housing. I think it also needs to be obviously around homelessness and emergency housing, so there's more investment going on there. Rental stress is becoming an obvious issue in New Zealand, with rents going up, particularly in a number of our regions, a hell of a lot more than incomes. And so I know that we are thinking a lot more around other kinds of support for housing supply for, say, build to rent. The Crown has a lot of land. It has a lot of land through the Crown Land Program or Housing New Zealand. There's a lot of land it could buy as well. Rent has to be part of, will probably be part of that offering as well. We have to get, I think the fact is, we can't, housing's a continuum from those that are really in dire straits to the market who don't actually need really our assistance. I think the government needs to be making sure that it's focused on the housing affordability and those on the cusp, and making sure it's really focused on those to the left who really do need our help, and it can't just focus on a narrow part of it.
Because that's one of the sad things, is a lot of political capital has been spent on getting KiwiBuild up and running, and it became bogged down in a question about, you're giving subsidies to rich people and all that stuff. And the only success story in the current system is Housing New Zealand, just building lots of state houses.
Yeah, I think we were...
Yeah, we're over time.
The red time limit has just blown up, which I think is a sign. A really interesting topic, and I think we could talk for a long time about these issues. And I'm sure everyone on the panel is available if anyone wants to talk to them after this. But I'm sure everyone also wants some lunch. So please join me in thanking the panellists today.
Cool. Thanks, David.
Thanks, sir. Good to see you. Yeah.